Hey there. Tonight, we're traveling to a place most history books prefer to skip over. Not to the grand halls or glittering courts, but to the parts of the past that involved bodily fluids, chamber pots, and the kind of work that made people hold their noses while counting their coins. This is a story about two very different jobs, separated by centuries and status, yet united by a single uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the worst work brings the best rewards. We're gonna meet medieval foolers, men who spent their days ankle deep in other people's urine, trampling cloth until it was clean enough for kings to wear. And we'll follow the career path of English courtiers who attended to the most intimate needs of their monarchs. Men who literally handled the royal backside and became some of the most powerful figures in the kingdom because of it. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, if these slow journeys through forgotten corners of history bring you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it actually helps. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something strangely comforting about knowing who else is out there, drifting off to the same peculiar tales of human ingenuity and desperation. So settle in. Dim the lights if you like. Let the soft hum of history wash over you. And let's begin with the most unlikely cleaning agent in human history: urine. Gallons and gallons of it. Because before there was detergent, before there was soap as we know it, there was piss. And an entire industry built on collecting it, aging it, and using it to turn rough, greasy wool into the finest cloth medieval Europe had ever seen. Part 1. The Foolers and their golden liquid. The problem nobody talks about: picture medieval England. The year is somewhere around 1300. Wool is everywhere. By this time, England has roughly 15 million sheep grazing across its hills and valleys, nearly 3 times the human population. Sheep outnumber people so dramatically that if you stand on any hillside and look out across the landscape, you're more likely to see a flock than a village. This is England's oil boom, its Silicon Valley, its economic engine. Wool built cathedrals. Wool funded wars. Wool was woven so deeply into the fabric of English identity that the Speaker of the House of Lords sat, and still sits, on a chair stuffed with wool, a seat called the woolsack, to remind everyone what really mattered. But raw wool, fresh off the sheep, is disgusting. It's not the soft, fluffy material you imagine when you think of a cozy sweater. It's greasy, matted, and filthy. Sheep produce lanolin, a waxy substance that coats their fleece to keep them waterproof. That same lanolin makes their wool nearly impossible to work with. When you shear a sheep, you're not getting clean fiber. You're getting something that smells like wet animal, feels like it's been dunked in cooking oil, and carries bits of grass, dirt, burrs, and occasionally sheep dung. The weavers need that lanolin during the weaving process. The grease helps the fibers slide past each other, makes the threads more pliable, prevents them from snapping under tension. So the wool gets spun and woven while still dirty, creating a loose weave fabric that's more like a greasy, scratchy net than anything you'd want against your skin. It's functional, barely, but it's not comfortable. It's not warm. It's not water-resistant once the lanolin is washed out. And it certainly isn't something a nobleman would wear, or a merchant would buy, or a knight would don beneath his armor. That's where the Fulu comes in. His job is to transform that rough, oily fabric into something usable. Something that can be dyed vibrant colors, cut into garments, and sold for actual money. The process is called fulling, and it involves 2 main steps. First, you have to scour the cloth, which means removing all that lanolin, all the oils, all the accumulated filth. Then you have to mill it, which means pounding and working the fibers until they mat together, creating a dense, warm, water-resistant fabric that actually feels like cloth rather than like something you'd use to scrub a floor. And to do both of those things, you need a cleaning agent. Something alkaline, something that can cut through grease, something that can break down oils and lift dirt. In the modern world, we've used detergent. In the ancient and medieval world, they had 2 options. One was a type of clay called fuller's earth, a naturally occurring mineral that absorbed oils when worked into wet fabric. The other was urine, human urine, preferably aged until it reeked like ammonia and made your eyes water. The science behind this is actually quite elegant, even if the practice was revolting. Fresh urine contains a compound called urea. When urine sits for a while, bacteria break down the urea into ammonia. Ammonia is a powerful base, highly alkaline, and it's remarkably good at dissolving fats and oils. When you soak greasy wool in stale urine and then work it vigorously, the ammonia strips away the lanolin, lifts out the dirt, and even begins to bleach the fabric slightly, giving it a cleaner, brighter appearance. The Romans figured this out centuries before the medieval period. They had entire industries built around fulling, with specialized workers called fulones, who operated fulonicae, shops where you could bring your dirty togas and tunics to be cleaned. The fulones collected urine in large clay jars placed strategically around the city, at street corners, outside taverns, near public latrines. Anyone could contribute. In fact, contributing was encouraged. The poor could make a few extra coins by collecting urine and selling it to the foolers. It was such a valuable commodity that the Emperor Vespasian, who ruled Rome from 69 to 79 CE, imposed a tax on it. The vectigal urinae, the urine tax, was levied on those who collected and sold urine for commercial purposes. Vespasian's son Titus was reportedly disgusted by the tax. Here was the emperor, the most powerful man in the world, collecting revenue from piss. It seemed beneath the dignity of Rome, so Titus complained to his father. Vespasian's response has echoed through history. He took a gold coin, one of the first payments from the urine tax, and held it under his son's nose. He asked, "Does it smell?" Titus admitted that it did not. "Yet it comes from urine," Vespasian replied. "Pecunia non olet." Money does not stink. The phrase became a proverb, a reminder that the value of money is not tainted by its source. It's still used today, usually to justify profiting from questionable enterprises. And it all started with taxing piss. By medieval times, that Roman knowledge had spread throughout Europe. Fulling was an established, essential trade, and the need for urine had not diminished. If anything, it had grown, because medieval Europe was producing more wool than ever before, and all of it needed to be fulled, which meant every fulling operation in every town needed a steady supply of the golden liquid. The life of a fuller, standing in other people's waste. Let's follow a man we'll call Thomas. He's not a historical figure, but he's representative of thousands of medieval fullers who lived and worked in England during the height of the wool trade. Thomas is in his 30s, which makes him older than many of his contemporaries. Life expectancy wasn't high, and the work he does is hard enough to age a man quickly. He wakes before dawn in a small cottage on the edge of town, shares the space with his wife, 3 children, and a goat that provides milk when she's feeling generous. Thomas doesn't own his home. He rents it. But he owns his trade, in a sense. He's a skilled fuller, and in a wool town, that means something. Not respect. Exactly. People tend to wrinkle their noses when he passes. But security. There's always work for a fuller. Always cloth that needs cleaning. Always someone willing to pay for the transformation of rough fabric into something wearable. His day begins with a walk to the fullery. In larger towns, these might be substantial workshops with multiple vats, several workers, and a steady stream of clients. In smaller villages, it might just be a shed with a few wooden tubs and a pile of fabric waiting to be processed. Thomas works in something in between, a modest operation owned by a master fuller who employs 3 or 4 men and usually a couple of young apprentices. The fullery smells before you see it. That's the first thing anyone notices. It's not a simple bad smell. It's layered. There's the sharp, eye-watering reek of ammonia from the aging urine. There's the wet animal smell of the wool itself. There's the earthy scent of fuller's earth, if they're using it. And underneath it all, there's the mustiness of damp fabric that's been sitting in lukewarm liquid for hours at a time. Mix it all together and you get a smell so distinctive, so penetrating, that foolers were known to carry it with them wherever they went. Their clothes reeked. Their skin reeked. Their wives complained that the smell never fully washed out of anything. But Thomas has long since stopped noticing. He's been doing this work since he was a boy, apprenticed to a fuller when he was 8 or 9 years old. His nose adapted years ago. What bothers him more is the cold, especially in winter when his hands are numb and the water in the vats is frigid, or the heat in summer when standing in a vat of warm, fermenting liquid for hours at a time makes him feel like he's being slowly stewed alive. The urine arrives in barrels. Some of it is purchased from collectors who go door to door, paying pennies for whatever the household can provide. The collectors carry clay jars or wooden buckets, knock politely, wait while the residents empty their chamber pots. It's a transaction both parties prefer to conduct quickly and without eye contact. The collectors then transport the urine to various foolers, who pay based on quantity and supposedly quality. Though how one judges the quality of urine is a matter of some debate. Some foolers claim that urine from people who've been drinking ale is less effective than urine from those who've drunk mostly water. Others insist that morning urine is stronger than evening urine. These distinctions may or may not be real, but they give the collectors something to argue about when negotiating prices. Some of the urine comes from taverns, where the proprietors are more than happy to sell the contents of their establishment's latrine pits. And some comes from monasteries, where the monks, pragmatic in all things, see no reason why their bodily waste shouldn't contribute to the local economy. After all, fooling is honest work, and honest work glorifies God, even if it smells like the opposite of glory. Once the urine arrives, it's stored. This is crucial. Fresh urine won't do the job. You need it to age, to ferment, to undergo that chemical transformation from urea to ammonia. So the barrels sit, sealed shut, for weeks or even months. The longer it ages, the stronger it gets and the better it works. By the time Thomas opens a barrel to pour it into a vat, the smell is so powerful it makes his eyes water even after all these years. The apprentices sometimes gag and run outside. Thomas just breathes through his mouth and gets on with it. The cloth arrives from the weavers. It comes in bolts, long stretches of loosely woven wool that still carry the grease and grime of the raw material. Thomas and his fellow foolers cut it into manageable lengths, carry it to the vats, and begin the process. First, they soak the cloth in a mixture of water and aged urine. The proportions vary depending on how dirty the cloth is, how strong the urine is, how experienced the fooler is at judging these things. Too much water and the mixture won't clean effectively. Too much urine and it can damage the fibers if left too long. It's a balance, learned through years of practice and more than a few ruined batches. Once the cloth is submerged and thoroughly wetted, the real work begins. Thomas climbs into the vat. He's barefoot. Everyone is. Shoes would just get destroyed. And besides, you need to feel the cloth beneath your feet. Need to sense when it's starting to respond to the treatment. The liquid comes up to his knees, sometimes higher depending on how much they've put in, and then he starts to walk. This is the fulling process, or at least the traditional version of it. The Romans called it the saltus fullinicus, the fuller's jump. You don't just stand still. You move. You march. You stomp. You dance almost, though calling it a dance makes it sound more graceful than it is. It's repetitive, rhythmic motion, hour after hour, designed to work the liquid through the fibers, to pound the cloth, to create friction that both cleans and begins to mat the wool. Thomas braces his hands on the sides of the vat for balance and begins his routine. Step, step, step. Press down, lift, shift the cloth with your feet. Step, step. He does this for hours. 7, 8, sometimes more. The cloth gradually transforms beneath him. At first, it's stiff and greasy. Slowly, it softens. The color of the liquid in the vat changes, darkening as the oils and dirt leach out. And the cloth itself starts to tighten. the fibers beginning to interlock. There's no music. No one sings while they work, though the Romans apparently did. The medieval English foolers just trudged through their day in near silence, broken only by the slosh of liquid, the occasional grunt of effort, and the master shouts when someone isn't keeping pace. Sometimes Thomas lets his mind wander. He thinks about his children. He wonders if the harvest will be good this year. He calculates how many more days of work it'll take to afford a new pair of boots for his wife. But mostly he just focuses on not slipping, on keeping his rhythm steady, on making it through to the end of the day without incident. Every couple of hours, they pull the cloth out to check its progress. They rinse it in cleaner water, wring it out, inspect it for any damage or uneven cleaning. If it's not ready, back it goes into the vat, and Thomas climbs back in. If it's getting close, they might add some fuller's earth, a fine clay that helps absorb any remaining oils. The earth is worked into the wet cloth, either by hand or by more stomping, and then the whole thing gets rinsed again. When the scouring is finally done, the cloth has to be finished. It's rinsed thoroughly in clean water, usually at the river, to remove any traces of ammonia and earth. Then it's wrung out, which takes at least 2 strong men pulling in opposite directions, because a wet bolt of wool is heavy and unwieldy. After that, it's stretched out to dry, either on racks or on the ground if the weather's good. Weighted down at the corners so the wind doesn't carry it off. While it dries, someone, usually an apprentice, goes over it with a teasel, a spiky seed head used to raise the nap, to fluff up the surface fibers and make the cloth soft to the touch. The finished product is almost miraculous if you've seen what it started as. What was once a greasy, smelly, rough-woven mess is now clean, dense, soft, and ready to be dyed or made into clothing. The transformation is complete. And Thomas, covered in a film of lanolin, urine, and fuller's earth, is already thinking about the next batch. He earns more than a field laborer. That's one of the few consolations of this work. A fuller can make 2 or even 3 times what a man working the harvest makes. It's skilled labor. It requires knowledge, experience, physical endurance. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone wants to do it. The smell alone drives most people away. But for Thomas, it's a living. It's enough to keep his family housed and fed, most of the time. It's enough to give him a small measure of pride, knowing that the cloth worn by knights and merchants and even lords passed through his hands, or rather, beneath his feet. His status, though, is complicated. He's not poor, but he's not respectable either. When he walks through the market, people step aside, not out of deference, but to avoid the smell. His children are sometimes teased by other children, called names that reference their father's occupation. His wife defends him fiercely, but even she sometimes wishes he'd chosen a different trade. When they attend church on Sundays, they sit toward the back, not because anyone tells them to, but because it's understood. The foolers have a community among themselves. They know they're outsiders. They share techniques, complain about the same problems, help each other out when times are hard. There's solidarity in shared misery. And there's a quiet pride, too. They know they're essential. Without foolers, there would be no wool trade. Without the wool trade, the whole economy would collapse. They're the foundation. Even if they're the foundation, everyone prefers not to look at too closely. Thomas goes home each evening exhausted. His feet ache. His legs are sore from hours of constant motion. His hands are chapped from being wet all day. He washes as best he can, but the smell lingers. His wife has learned to tolerate it, though she makes him leave his work clothes outside. They eat a simple dinner, usually pottage, sometimes bread if they're lucky, occasionally fish. The children chatter. The goat bleats from her corner, and Thomas sits by the fire, warming his tired feet, and prepares to do it all again tomorrow. The business of urine, an economic ecosystem. The urine trade was more complex than you might imagine. It wasn't just a matter of collecting waste and selling it. There was a whole ecosystem built around it, with collectors, sellers, brokers, and of course, the foolers themselves. And like any commodity, urine had a market value that fluctuated based on supply and demand. In a busy wool town, the demand for urine was constant. Multiple fulleries might be operating simultaneously, each one needing barrels of aged urine every week. This created opportunity for enterprising individuals who saw waste as a resource. Urine collectors became a recognized, if not entirely respected, profession. They went by various names depending on the region: land gatherers, piss prophets, or simply collectors. These men, and occasionally women, made their rounds early in the morning, before the streets got too busy, before anyone respectable was out and about. They carried their collection vessels, knocked on doors, made their purchases. A few pennies bought several gallons. It wasn't much money, but for the very poor, it was something. For households, it was a way to make use of something they'd otherwise just be dumping in the street or into a cesspit. The collectors then transported their haul to storage facilities. These might be owned by the collectors themselves, or by middlemen who bought the urine in bulk and then resold it to the foolers. The storage was crucial. Remember, fresh urine wasn't useful. It needed to ferment, to age, to transform. So the barrels sat in warehouses or sheds, or sometimes just outside in a yard, sealed shut, slowly cooking in their own bacteria. The smell in these storage areas was, by all accounts, apocalyptic. No one lived nearby if they could help it. The price of urine varied. In times when the wool trade was booming, when cloth production was high and fullers were working overtime, the price went up. More demand, same supply, basic economics. In quieter times, when trade slowed, the price dropped. There were also quality distinctions, though how much of this was real versus how much was savvy marketing is hard to say. Some collectors claimed to source urine only from healthy individuals who followed specific diets. Others boasted about the age of their product, the perfection of its fermentation. Foolers, for their part, developed preferences. They'd swear that urine from one collector was superior to another's, though whether they could actually tell the difference in a blind test is questionable. There was also imported urine. Yes, you read that correctly. Some regions were known for producing particularly effective urine, and it was shipped to other areas where local supplies couldn't meet demand. Portuguese urine was apparently prized for its strength, likely due to differences in diet or in the way it was processed. It's hard to imagine being a merchant whose trade route involved shipping barrels of fermented piss across the continent. But someone did it and presumably made money from it. The foolers themselves sometimes cut out the middlemen. Some fooleries maintained their own collection systems, hiring collectors directly or even setting up collection points where locals could drop off their contributions. A few of the larger operations had contracts with nearby monasteries or hospitals, ensuring a steady, reliable supply. This vertical integration made economic sense. Why pay markup to a broker when you could control your own supply chain? There were regulations too. Medieval towns loved their regulations. Authorities wanted to make sure that the urine trade didn't create public health hazards, or at least didn't create worse hazards than it already did. So there were rules about where you could store urine, how it could be transported, who could sell it. Violations could result in fines or even the loss of your license to operate. The fact that there were licenses for urine collecting tells you something about how seriously the trade was taken. And of course, there was fraud. In any market where a commodity is in demand and visually indistinguishable from similar products, someone will try to cut corners. Unscrupulous collectors sometimes watered down their urine to stretch their supply. Since urine was often mixed with water anyway when used for fulling, this wasn't immediately obvious. But experienced foolers could tell. The ammonia content would be weaker, the cleaning would be less effective. Word would get around, and the collector's reputation would suffer. In a trade that depended on relationships and trust, that could be fatal to business. The economics of fulling itself were fascinating. The foolery, as a business, had to balance several factors. There was rent on the workspace. There were wages for the workers, assuming it wasn't just the master fuller doing everything himself. There was the cost of the urine, which could be substantial. There was fuller's earth, if they used it. There was the cost of transporting fabric to and from the river for rinsing. And there was the risk of damage. If you overfull cloth, if you left it in too long, if you used a batch of urine that was too strong or too weak, you could ruin expensive fabric. That would have to be paid for, and it could wipe out weeks of profit. On the other side, the fees charged for fulling were significant enough to make the trade viable. Weavers needed fullers. They had no choice. They couldn't sell unfulled cloth, not for anything near what fulled cloth would fetch. So they paid. And because the work was skilled, because it took years to learn to do it properly, because the barriers to entry were high, fullers could command decent prices. Not enough to get rich, but enough to live on, which was more than many trades could promise. The masters of larger fulleries could do quite well. They weren't nobles. They weren't merchants. But they were solid, middle-tier tradesmen with property, with apprentices, with a place in the town hierarchy. Some even served on town councils or in guilds, though they were rarely at the top of those organizations. The smell, always the smell, kept them from climbing too high socially. But economically, they were comfortable. The workers, like Thomas, made enough to survive and not much more. They were wage laborers, paid by the day or by the piece, depending on the arrangement. They had no ownership stake in the business, no share of the profits beyond their wages. If work slowed, they didn't get paid. If they got sick, they didn't get paid. It was precarious, like most medieval work, but it was steady. There was always more cloth to full, always more urine to stomp through. And so the ecosystem functioned. Collectors gathered waste. Brokers stored and sold it. Fullers bought it and used it. Weavers brought their cloth. Merchants bought the finished product. And at the center of it all was urine, transformed from worthless waste into valuable commodity through nothing more than time and bacteria. It was recycling before recycling had a name. It was circular economy before economists coined the term. It was disgusting, practical, ingenious, and completely essential. Vespasian was right. Money doesn't stink. But the process of making it certainly did. The end of an era. Mills and modernity for centuries. Fulling remained essentially unchanged. Cloth in a vat, urine added, feet stomping for hours. It worked. Why fix what isn't broken? But medieval people weren't as resistant to innovation as we sometimes imagine. When they saw a chance to make work easier or more productive, they took it. And in the case of fulling, that innovation came in the form of water power. The fulling mill first appeared in England around the 11th century, though it took several more centuries to really spread. The concept was borrowed from grain mills, which have been using water power for generations. Someone, probably multiple someones in different places, had the idea to apply the same principle to fulling. Instead of human feet, you'd use wooden hammers. Instead of human energy, you'd use the river's energy. The river would never get tired. The river would never ask for wages. The earliest fulling mills were simple. A water wheel turned by the current. The wheel's axle had cams attached, small protrusions that, as the wheel turned, would lift and drop wooden hammers called fulling stocks. These hammers were positioned over vats or troughs, similar to the hand-fulling vats but larger. The cloth would be laid in the trough with the fulling liquid, and the hammers would pound down on it repeatedly, mechanically doing what human feet had done for centuries. The sound of a fulling mill in operation was distinctive, a steady thump, thump, thump echoing across the valley. It could be heard for miles. In wool-producing regions, that sound became as much a part of the landscape as the bleating of sheep or the clatter of looms. It meant work. It meant industry. It meant someone was making money. The mills were usually located on faster streams, places where the current was strong enough to turn the wheel reliably. This often meant they were outside of town centers in more rural areas, which was fine. Most weavers didn't mind the extra distance if it meant cheaper fulling, and cheaper it was. A mill could process more cloth in a day than several human fullers could, And it could do it with just 1 or 2 men overseeing the operation instead of a whole crew. Labor costs dropped. Production increased. Prices came down, making fulled cloth more affordable and further boosting the wool trade. But here's the thing. The mills still needed urine. The hammers could do the pounding, but they couldn't replace the chemical action of ammonia on wool. The cloth still had to be soaked in aged urine before being placed under the hammers. The urine trade didn't disappear. It just shifted. Instead of being delivered to urban fulleries, it was now being transported to rural mill sites. The collectors still made their rounds. The barrels still fermented. The smell still lingered. Thomas, our hypothetical fuller, might have found himself out of a job when a mill opened nearby. Or he might have been hired by the mill owner to oversee operations, since he had the knowledge and experience to judge when cloth was properly fulled. Some traditional fullers resisted the mills, saw them as a threat. Others adapted. Still others retired early or switched trades. It was a transition, as all technological transitions are, with winners and losers. The mills spread throughout Europe over the following centuries. By the late medieval period, they were common wherever there was a wool industry and suitable water flow. England's valleys filled with them, particularly in regions like the Cotswolds, Yorkshire, and the Southwest. The landscape itself changed. Mill ponds were created by damming streams. Mill races, artificial channels, directed water to the wheels. Entire villages grew up around successful mills, their economies dependent on the steady thump of the fulling stocks. But even the mills had their limits. They could pound the cloth, but they couldn't do the fine finishing work. That still required human hands. After milling, the cloth had to be rinsed, stretched, dried, and napped. It had to be inspected for damage. It had to be measured and prepared for sale. So fullers didn't entirely disappear. They just became less central to the process. Their job shifted from the primary labor to a supporting role, and eventually, even the urine began to be replaced. In the Renaissance period, chemists started experimenting with other alkaline substances. Potash, derived from wood ash. Soda ash, refined from various minerals. These substances could do the same job as ammonia without the smell, without the collection infrastructure, without the social stigma. They were more expensive initially, but as production methods improved, the cost came down. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Industrial Revolution transformed textile production, urine had mostly vanished from the fulling process. New chemicals, new methods, new machines took over. The last fulling mills eventually closed or converted to other uses. The trade that had sustained thousands of workers for centuries disappeared into history, remembered only by historians and the occasional person who stumbles across the word fuller in an old document and wonders what it meant. But for a long time, for most of human history really, this was how cloth got clean. This was how rough wool became soft fabric. Through the labor of men like Thomas, through the indignity of collecting and aging human waste, through the pragmatic realization that sometimes the most effective solution is also the most unpleasant one, the fullers understood what Vespasian understood. Dignity is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills. And in the end, nobody asked where the ammonia came from as long as their clothes looked good. Transition. From one kind of waste to another, we've spent considerable time with the fullers, wading through their vats, breathing their air, understanding how they made their living from what everyone else threw away. It's tempting to think of their story as unique, a strange quirk of medieval economics that has no parallel. But history often rhymes, and sometimes it repeats in surprising ways. While English fullers were stomping through urine in service of the wool trade, building their modest prosperity on the foundation of other people's bodily waste, a different kind of waste-related career was emerging in the highest levels of society. This one didn't involve wool or cloth or industrial processes. It involved something far more personal, far more intimate. It involved attending to the king himself in his most private moments. The connection might not be immediately obvious, What does a medieval trade worker have in common with a Tudor courtier? What links the man in the vat to the man in the palace? The answer is simple. Both found opportunity where others saw only waste. Both transformed degradation into prosperity. Both proved that sometimes the worst jobs come with the best rewards. So let's leave Thomas and his fellow foolers behind. Let's wash our hands, metaphorically speaking, though the smell will linger. And let's travel forward in time and upward in social status to meet men who served kings, who shaped policy, who controlled access to the most powerful figures in England. Men whose job description included carrying a chamber pot. Men known as the grooms of the stool. If you think fooling sounds unpleasant, wait until you hear what these gentlemen had to do. And if you think foolers had it tough socially, wait until you see how the courtiers who handled royal excrement somehow became the most feared, most respected, most influential figures in the entire kingdom. Part 2. The groom of the stool. The king has no privacy to understand why the groom of the stool existed. You first have to understand what it meant to be a king in medieval and early modern England. We tend to imagine monarchs as people with ultimate freedom, unlimited power, no restrictions on their time or actions. But the reality was almost the opposite. A king had less privacy than almost anyone else in the kingdom. From the moment he woke until the moment he slept, the king was surrounded by people. Servants dressed him, served his meals, attended his every movement. Courtiers competed for the privilege of being in his presence. Foreign ambassadors demanded audiences. Nobles jockeyed for favor. The king ate in front of crowds. He gave orders in crowded rooms. He made decisions with dozens of witnesses. Even his bedchamber, his supposedly private space, was constantly full of attendants. This wasn't cruelty or incompetence. It was security and protocol. Medieval and Tudor monarchs faced constant threats. Assassination, poisoning, abduction, coup attempts. They couldn't afford to be alone. Being alone meant being vulnerable. So they were never alone. Every action, every moment, was witnessed and recorded, if not officially then, in the memories of those present. But there was one time, one brief moment each day, when even a king needed something approaching privacy, when nature called, when his bowels demanded attention, when he needed to use the toilet. Now, let's be clear about what a royal toilet was. It wasn't the porcelain throne we know today. In fact, it had another kind of throne entirely. The closed stool, sometimes called a stool of ease, was a portable commode. Imagine a wooden box, roughly chair height, with a hole cut in the top. Inside the box sat a pewter or occasionally silver chamber pot. The exterior of the box was often upholstered in velvet, usually red or purple, sometimes embroidered with royal insignia. The seat itself might be padded with cushions. Armrests were optional, but common for older monarchs. This contraption was portable. It could be moved from room to room as needed. It was far more comfortable than the garderobe. The medieval alternative, which was essentially a stone seat built into a castle wall with a shaft that dropped waist down to the moat or a cesspit far below. The closed stool represented luxury. It was warm. It was private, or as private as anything a king did could be. And it required maintenance. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to position it. Someone had to provide water, towels, and a basin for washing afterwards. Someone had to remove it when the business was done and empty the chamber pot. Someone had to clean everything, to check the king's health by examining what he'd left behind, to report any concerns to the royal physicians. And someone had to be discreet about all of this, to never speak of it, to treat it as the routine matter it was rather than as something scandalous or amusing. That someone was the groom of the stool. The office was created during the reign of Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, who came to power in 1485 after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry was paranoid, understandably so given that his claim to the throne wasn't exactly ironclad, and there were plenty of people who thought they had better claims. He surrounded himself with loyalists, restructured the royal household, and created new positions designed to ensure both his safety and his comfort. The Privy Chamber was Henry's innovation. It was a series of rooms beyond the public state apartments, rooms where the king could retreat, where only a select few were allowed entry. And among those few, the closest, the most trusted, was the groom of the king's close stool, soon shortened to simply the groom of the stool. The original purpose was practical. The king needed someone to manage his toilet. Fine. But almost immediately, the position became something more. Because when you attend to someone's most private needs, when you see them at their most vulnerable, when you spend time with them in moments when their guard is down, you develop a relationship that goes beyond employer and employee. You become a confidant. Think about it. The king spends all day in formal settings, wearing his crown figuratively, if not literally, always performing, always aware of being watched. Then he needs to relieve himself. He retreats to his private chamber. The groom is there, the one man allowed to see the king at his least regal. No crown, no robes. Just a man with digestive issues like anyone else. And in that moment, the king is human. He can speak freely. He can ask questions. He can voice concerns he wouldn't dare voice in front of the council. He can even show weakness. And the groom? He listens. He advises if asked. He keeps secrets. He becomes the one person the king can actually trust, because the groom's entire career depends on the king's favor, and betraying the king's confidence would end that career immediately, and probably fatally. This is how a position that started as essentially a royal bathroom attendant evolved into one of the most powerful offices in the English court. The daily reality. What did they actually do? Let's talk specifics. What exactly were the responsibilities of the groom of the stool? The basic job description was straightforward. The groom had several core duties related to the king's toileting needs. First, he was responsible for the close stool itself. He ensured it was always available, always clean, always properly maintained. The upholstery had to be in good condition. The chamber pot had to be spotless. The water for washing had to be fresh and warm. Towels had to be clean and soft. Nothing could be left to chance. If the king called for his stool and it wasn't ready, that was the groom's fault. If anything was dirty or broken or substandard, that was the groom's fault. Second, he attended the king during the act itself. This is where historical debate comes in. Did the groom actually wipe the royal backside? Or did he merely hand the king a cloth? Sources are unclear, deliberately so, because this wasn't the sort of detail contemporary writers wanted to dwell on. What we know for certain is that the groom provided whatever assistance was necessary. Water for washing, cloths for drying, basins positioned at the right height. He was there, in the room, handling the intimate logistics. Third, and this sounds strange to modern ears, but was actually crucial, he monitored the king's bowel movements. Medieval medicine believed that health could be diagnosed through examination of bodily waste. The color, consistency, smell, and frequency of the king's stool, the substance, not the chair, were all considered important indicators. Was he constipated? That might mean an imbalance of humors. Was there blood? That required immediate attention. Was everything normal and regular? Good. The king was healthy. The groom kept track of all this. He reported to the royal physicians. He noted what the king ate and when he evacuated. He probably maintained records, though if he did, they haven't survived because no one wanted to preserve such documents. But this monitoring was genuinely important. Kings died of preventable illnesses all the time. Early detection could make the difference between a minor complaint and a fatal condition. Fourth, he controlled access to the privy chamber. As the most intimate servant, the groom became the gatekeeper. If you wanted private time with the king, you had to go through the groom. If you wanted to deliver a message when the king was in his personal quarters, the groom decided whether it was important enough to interrupt. If you wanted to join the king's inner circle, you needed the groom's approval, at least tacitly. This access control was enormous power. Nobles, bishops, foreign ambassadors, they all courted the groom. They gave him gifts, invited him to dinners, treated him with exaggerated respect, because the groom could whisper a word in the king's ear that you'd never hear. He could pass along a message that never officially existed. He could make sure your petition reached the king, or he could make sure it disappeared without trace. Fifth, he managed the privy purse. This started under Henry VII and expanded under Henry VIII. The privy purse was the king's personal money, separate from the official treasury. It was used for private expenses, for gambling, for gifts, for anything the king wanted without having to explain it to Parliament or the Lord Treasurer. The groom kept the books. He dispersed the funds. He knew where every penny went, which meant he knew the king's vices, his debts, his mistresses, all of it. And finally, the groom oversaw the other servants in the privy chamber. By Henry VIII's reign, this had become a substantial bureaucracy. There were gentlemen of the privy chamber, grooms of various types, pages, ushers. All of them reported to the groom of the stool, or at least answered to him in some capacity. He was, in effect, the king's chief of staff. Now, about that wiping question, since it comes up, did the groom actually clean the king's rear? Probably not routinely. The king was capable of wiping himself, and there's no real evidence that this was an expected service. But did the groom assist in some way? Hand the cloth? Hold the basin? Help with the washing? Almost certainly. The position required handling all the intimate logistics. And in an era when personal hygiene was more hands-on and less private than we're used to, the line between helping and doing was blurry. What we can say for sure is that the groom's duties brought him into extremely close physical proximity to the king on a daily basis. He saw the king undressed, indisposed, vulnerable. That created a relationship unlike any other in the court. And that relationship, more than any specific duty, was what made the position so powerful. The power behind the throne. Sometimes the groom of the stool had the king's ear, literally, multiple times a day. In moments when the king was relaxed, unguarded, human, what could you do with that kind of access? The answer is almost anything. You could shake policy by suggesting ideas when the king was receptive. You could destroy careers by mentioning concerns about someone's loyalty. You could enrich yourself by steering contracts to your friends. You could protect your family by warning them of impending trouble. You could even, if you were ambitious and reckless enough, play kingmaker by influencing succession. The most powerful grooms understood this and used it carefully. They didn't abuse their position openly. They didn't demand. They suggested. They didn't threaten. They advised. They were subtle, patient, strategic. And they got results. Other courtiers feared the groom because he knew things. He knew what the king thought about people. He knew which policies were being considered. He knew when the king was angry or pleased or distracted. In a court where information was power, the groom was the best informed man in the kingdom. But power came with risks. Because the groom's entire position depended on the king's favor, losing that favor meant losing everything. And favor could be lost in an instant. A careless word. A perceived betrayal. A simple change in the king's mood. One day you're at the pinnacle. The next, you're nobody. Or worse, you're on trial. The groom of the stool was as precarious a position as it was prestigious, which is why the men who held it tended to be either very cautious or very bold. There wasn't much middle ground. And their stories, the stories of these men who served at the king's most intimate moments, tell us as much about Tudor politics as any battle or treaty. Hugh Denny, the foundation, the first groom of the stool we know much about, was Hugh Denny, who served Henry VII from around 1487 until the king's death in 1509. Denny wasn't a nobody when he got the position. He came from the Gloucestershire gentry, a solid family with land and connections. But he wasn't nobility. He was exactly the kind of man Henry VII preferred. Loyal, competent, ambitious enough to work hard, but not so ambitious as to be a threat. Denny held the position for over 20 years. That kind of longevity tells you something. He was good at his job. He managed the king's health, kept the privy chamber running smoothly, and crucially, kept the king's confidence. In an era when Henry VII was notorious for his paranoia and his willingness to destroy anyone he suspected of disloyalty, Remaining in favor for 2 decades was an achievement, and Denis prospered. By the time he died in 1511, 2 years after his master, he owned at least 4 manors: Osterley in Middlesex, Wyke, Gray's Inn, Purley. The exact mechanism of how he acquired all this property is murky. Some of it was certainly purchased with his wages, which were substantial. Some may have been gifts from the king, and some, historians suggest, may have been property held in trust, officially in Denis's name but actually belonging to the royal privy purse, a way of hiding assets. Regardless of the technical details, Denis died a wealthy man. His will was long and complex, distributing property to religious institutions, to family, to various beneficiaries. He was buried at Sheen Priory, near the king's favorite palace of Richmond, a final sign of his status. His grave is lost now, destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries. But for a brief moment in history, Hugh Denis was one of the most important men in England, and he got there by carrying a chamber pot. William Compton. The friend Henry VIII's first groom of the stool was William Compton. Appointed shortly after the young king's accession in 1509, Compton was different from Denis. He wasn't just a trusted servant. He was Henry's friend, a companion from childhood, someone the king genuinely liked. This changed the dynamic of the position. Henry VIII was 80 when he became king, energetic, gregarious, athletic, desperate to prove himself after growing up in his cautious father's shadow. He wanted to joust, to hunt, to party, and he wanted his friends around him. Compton was one of those friends, rewarded with the groom position, not just for his competence, but for his companionship. Compton's duties went beyond the close stool. He helped arrange the king's romantic entanglements, serving as a go-between when Henry was pursuing a new mistress. This was delicate work. The king was married, publicly Christian, and concerned about his reputation. But he was also young and virile, and not particularly faithful. Compton helped manage the logistics, the discretion, the unfortunate moments when things went wrong. He was, in modern terms, the king's fixer, and he was richly compensated. Compton received land grants, offices, leases, pensions, all manner of income. By the end of his service, he was earning an estimated £2,000 per year, an absolutely massive sum equivalent to the income of a wealthy nobleman or a bishop. He built a grand house. He married well. He lived like a lord. But in 1528, sweating sickness swept through England. The disease appeared suddenly, killed quickly. You could be fine in the morning and dead by evening. It hit the rich as hard as the poor, possibly harder since it seemed to target young, healthy adults. Compton contracted it. Despite all his wealth, all his connections, all his access to the best physicians in the land, he died within hours. He was buried at his home in Warwickshire, and his widow inherited everything, which at least gave her some comfort. Henry Norris, the dangerous game after Compton's death. Henry VIII appointed Sir Henry Norris as groom of the stool. Norris had been at court for years, working his way up through various positions. He was close to the king, trusted, competent, but he was also close to someone else, Queen Anne Boleyn. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. Anne Boleyn's rise had been spectacular. Henry had divorced his first wife, broken with Rome, risked civil war, all to marry Anne. But by 1536, their relationship had soured. Anne had failed to produce a male heir. Henry was infatuated with Jane Seymour, and Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, saw an opportunity to get rid of Anne and replace her with a more compliant queen. Cromwell manufactured charges of adultery, treason, and incest. He needed scapegoats, men who could plausibly be accused of having affairs with the queen. Norris was one of them. As groom of the stool, he was constantly in the king's presence, which meant he was also often in Anne's presence. He was known to be friendly with her, and most importantly, he had access, he had opportunity, and Cromwell had the imagination to construct a narrative around those facts. On May 1st, 1536, Norris was arrested. He was interrogated, tortured, urged to confess. but he refused. He maintained his innocence and the Queen's. On May 17th, he was tried before a jury of his peers, all of whom knew exactly what verdict Henry expected. He was found guilty. On May 17, 1536, Henry Norris was beheaded on Tower Hill, alongside 4 other men accused of adultery with Anne Boleyn. 2 days later, Anne herself was executed. Norris never broke. He never confessed. He went to his death, insisting on his innocence. Most historians now believe he was innocent, that the charges were fabrications designed to justify Henry's desire to rid himself of Anne. But that didn't save him. Being the groom of the stool meant being close to power, but it also meant being vulnerable to power's whims. One careless word, one moment of standing too close to the wrong person, and you could lose your head. Literally. Thomas Heneage, the survivor after Norris's execution, Henry appointed Sir Thomas Heneage as groom of the stool. Heneage had watched Norris die. He understood the danger, so he took a different approach. He was careful. He was cautious. He avoided court intrigue as much as possible. He did his job, served the king faithfully, and kept his mouth shut. This strategy worked. Heneage served from 1536 until 1546, through Anne Boleyn's execution, through Henry's marriages to Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. He saw queens rise and fall. He watched Cromwell himself eventually fall from favor and die on the scaffold. And through it all, Heneage survived by being reliable, boring, and essential. He wasn't powerless. He still had access to the king. He still managed the privy purse, which by now was handling tens of thousands of pounds. He still controlled who got into the privy chamber, but he didn't use that power for political maneuvering. He used it to keep things running smoothly, to make the king comfortable, to ensure that when Henry VIII was in pain, aging, and increasingly unhealthy, he had someone he could rely on. Heneage retired in 1546. He stepped down voluntarily, perhaps sensing that the king's health was failing and wanting to avoid the chaos that would follow his death. He lived quietly for several more years and died of natural causes. In a court where so many ended violently, that was an achievement. Anthony Denny. The final service, Henry VIII's last groom of the stool, was Sir Anthony Denny. He took over from Heneage in October 1546, just months before the king's death. Denny was everything a groom should be. Discreet, competent, loyal. But he was also more than that. He was politically savvy, administratively brilliant, and trusted with responsibilities that went far beyond the close stool. Denny was keeper of the privy purse, yes, but he also had control of the dry stamp, a device that reproduced the king's signature. This was necessary because Henry's health was so bad he could no longer sign documents himself. His hand trembled. His eyesight was failing. So Denny signed for him with the king's blessing, effectively wielding royal authority. Denny also helped draft Henry's will. This was one of the most important documents in English history, determining who would rule after Henry's death and how the kingdom would be governed during the minority of his son Edward. Denny's influence on that document was substantial, and crucially, Denny was the one who told Henry he was dying. On January 27, 1547, the king's health took a final turn for the worse. His physicians knew he wouldn't survive the night, but no one dared tell him. To predict the king's death was treason, but someone had to do it. The king needed to prepare his soul to receive the sacrament to make peace with God. That someone was Denny. He went to the king's bedside. He told Henry, gently, that the end was near. He asked if the king wanted a priest. Henry asked for Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer arrived, took Henry's hand, and asked if he trusted in Christ. Henry, too weak to speak clearly, squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was enough. Henry VIII died early on January 28th. Denny was there. And then Denny, along with the other members of the Regency Council, immediately began the transition of power. Edward VI, 9 years old, was proclaimed king. England entered a new era, and Denny having served his master to the very end, stepped into a new role in the new regime, though he would die himself just 2 years later. The story of Anthony Denny illustrates what the position of groom of the stool had become. It wasn't just about the close stool anymore, if it ever had been. It was about access, about trust, about being the person the king turned to when everything else failed. It was about holding power without ever quite acknowledging how much power you held. It was about serving discreetly and being rewarded handsomely. Evolution and abolition. The groom becomes a ghost after Henry VIII's death. The position of groom of the stool continued but gradually changed. Under Edward VI, the young king had a groom. Though a child's bathroom habits were probably less complex than an aging monarch's, under Mary I and Elizabeth I, the position didn't exist in the same form. It wasn't appropriate for male courtiers to attend queens in such intimate ways. Instead, Elizabeth had ladies of the bedchamber who performed similar functions, though with different titles and somewhat different duties. When the Stuart dynasty took over in 1603, the position was revived for male monarchs, but with a new name. The groom of the stool became the groom of the stole. Stole, from the Latin stola, referred to royal robes. It was a genteel euphemism, a way of distancing the position from its scatological origins. The groom of the stole was now officially in charge of the king's wardrobe, not his waist. But the real work hadn't entirely changed. The groom of the stole still had intimate access to the monarch, still controlled the bedchamber, still managed significant sums of money, still wielded influence. The name had changed, but the power dynamics remained. The position continued through the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, though its importance waxed and waned depending on the monarch. Some kings kept their grooms at arm's length, reducing them to mere ceremonial figures. Others maintained close relationships, continuing the Tudor tradition of using their groom as a confidant and advisor. Queen Victoria, when she came to the throne in 1837, did not appoint a groom of the stole for herself, but her husband Prince Albert had one, as did her son Edward, the Prince of Wales. When Edward became King Edward VII in 1901, one of his first acts was to abolish the position. He considered it outdated, undignified, a relic of a cruder age. The role had outlived its usefulness. Modern monarchs had staff for everything, proper staff with proper titles, not euphemisms about stools and stoles. And so, after more than 400 years, the groom of the stool disappeared. The last man to hold a version of the title was James Hamilton, 2nd Duke of Abercorn, who served Edward when he was still Prince of Wales. When Edward became king, Hamilton's position vanished. No replacement was named. The office simply ceased to exist, but the history remained. The stories of Hugh Denis and William Compton and Henry Norris and Anthony Denny, the reminder that power takes strange forms, that access can be more valuable than armies, that sometimes the most influential person in the kingdom is the one holding the chamber pot. Comparison and conclusion, two sides of the same coin. At first glance, there's not much connecting a medieval fuller and a Tudor courtier. One stomped cloth and a vat of urine. The other carried a royal commode. One came from the working class, made a modest living, and died in relative obscurity. The other came from the gentry, became rich and powerful, and occasionally ended up in history books or on the scaffold. They lived in different worlds, centuries apart in some cases, with completely different daily experiences. But look closer, and the connections emerge. Both dealt with human waste as a core part of their profession. Both found that the work everyone else considered degrading could actually be profitable, even essential. Both lived with social stigma, the fuller for his smell, the courtier for his intimacy with bodily functions. And both proved that sometimes the worst jobs can lead to unexpected rewards. The fuller's relationship with urine was purely practical. He needed it for his trade. It was a tool, nothing more. He didn't think about it philosophically. He just used it day after day because it worked. And yes, it made him socially marginal, the butt of jokes, The man people avoided at parties, but it also made him employed. It gave him a skill that was always in demand, a trade that couldn't be easily replaced. In an era when most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation, that security was worth any amount of social discomfort. The groom's relationship with the close stool was more complex. He couldn't just view it as a tool. It was too intimately connected to the person he served. But he learned, as all successful grooms did, to treat it as routine, to normalize it, to strip away any embarrassment or disgust, and simply perform the necessary tasks with dignity and efficiency. And in doing so, he gained something the Fuller never could: access to power. The Fuller's work kept him at the margins. The groom's work placed him at the center. Both jobs required a certain pragmatism, a willingness to do what others wouldn't. Medieval and early modern people weren't any more comfortable with bodily waste than we are. They just had fewer options for dealing with it. The Fuller accepted that textile production required urine because the alternatives didn't work as well. The groom accepted that royal service might include bathroom duty because the alternatives were not serving royalty at all. And both roles tell us something about how medieval and early modern people viewed the body. We modern Westerners tend to be intensely private about bodily functions. We build elaborate plumbing systems to hide them. We create euphemisms to avoid discussing them. We teach children that such things are not polite conversation. But medieval people couldn't afford that level of squeamishness. Bodies produced waste. That waste had to be dealt with. Sometimes, like in the case of fulling, it could even be useful. There was no point pretending otherwise. This practical attitude extended to healthcare. Remember that the groom monitored the king's stool, the substance, for signs of illness. This wasn't perverted curiosity. It was medicine. In an era before blood tests or x-rays or any of the diagnostic tools we take for granted, physicians relied on observation. They looked at skin color, felt pulses, smelled breath, and yes, examined excrement. It was how they did their jobs. And the groom, being present for the production of said excrement, naturally became part of the diagnostic process. The Fuller's work was less medical, but equally based on observation and experience. He had to judge when cloth was properly cleaned, when it had been fulled enough, when it needed more time or different treatment. He developed an eye for it, a sense of what worked. He couldn't run laboratory tests. He just had to know, through years of practice, through trial and error, through the accumulated wisdom passed down from master to apprentice. Both the Fuller and the groom operated in economies where waste wasn't waste. It was resource. The Fuller turned urine into clean cloth. The groom turned proximity to royal waste into political influence. In both cases, what everyone else wanted to dispose of became, in the right hands, valuable. This is pre-industrial circular economy at its finest. Nothing was truly useless. Everything could be repurposed, recycled, transformed into something else. Of course, there were limits. The Fuller couldn't escape the smell, no matter how valuable his work was. And the groom, despite his power, was always just one misstep away from losing everything. Neither position was truly safe or comfortable. Both came with costs that went beyond the physical labor involved. But they endured. Fulling lasted for centuries until mechanization and chemical innovation made it obsolete. The groom of the stool lasted for 4 centuries until changing sensibilities made it unthinkable. Both left their marks on history, even if those marks are now mostly forgotten. What we learn from waste, if there's a broader lesson here, beyond the simple historical curiosity of learning about strange old jobs, it's this. Every society has to deal with its waste. How it chooses to do so tells you a lot about that society's values, priorities, and creativity. Medieval England chose to put its waste to use. Urine became industry. Close attendance to kings became governance. Nothing was too low, too disgusting, too undignified to be practical. This wasn't because medieval people were coarse or unrefined. It was because they were practical. They had limited resources and unlimited needs. They couldn't afford to let anything go to waste, not even waste itself. We've become much better at hiding our waste. We flush it away and never think about where it goes. We wash our clothes with industrial chemicals we don't understand and never see produced. We elect politicians who never reveal their vulnerabilities, who maintain carefully constructed images, who would no sooner allow someone to attend them on a closed stool than they would broadcast their tax returns. This is progress, mostly. Our sanitation systems have saved countless lives. Our privacy allows us dignity. Our chemical industries have made life easier and more comfortable. We shouldn't romanticize the past or wish to return to a world of urine-soaked cloth and chamber pots. But maybe we've lost something too. Maybe there was value in that unflinching practicality, in that willingness to deal with uncomfortable realities head-on rather than hiding them behind porcelain and plumbing. Maybe there was wisdom in understanding that every system, no matter how dignified its facade, ultimately rests on someone doing the dirty work. Maybe we need to remember the foolers and the grooms, not because their jobs were glamorous, but because they remind us that civilization requires, at its foundation, people willing to do what others won't. The fooler transformed waste into wealth. The groom transformed intimacy into influence. And together, they tell a story about human ingenuity, about the strange places we find opportunity, about the unexpected rewards that sometimes come from the worst work. So the next time you wash your clothes in clean-smelling detergent, the next time you flush a toilet without a second thought, the next time you thank goodness for modern plumbing and modern privacy, maybe spare a thought for the people who made do without those luxuries. For Thomas, ankle-deep in a vat, stomping cloth hour after hour. For you, Denis, and William Compton and Anthony Denny, carrying chamber pots and keeping secrets and building careers in the most unlikely of places. They didn't have it easy. They didn't have it clean, but they had it figured out. And in their own strange way, they thrived. Not despite the waste, but because of it. That's the business of waste. Unpleasant, undignified, and absolutely essential. Just like so much of history. Thank you for listening. If this strange journey through medieval commerce and Tudor courts helped you relax, brought you to the edge of sleep, or just gave you something peculiar to think about, I appreciate you being here. Feel free to like and subscribe if it feels right. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always good to know who else is out there, falling asleep to stories about chamber pots and centuries-old urine. Sleep well, and be grateful for modern plumbing.